Every story that you've ever read or watched or heard in your life followed a structure. You might not have noticed it, but every story had a story structure. And every story that you've ever heard, read, or watched in your life has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Simple. That's the story structure right there. A beginning, a middle, end. Yeah. So with that in mind, you know that when you start a story, the story must start. It must have the middle, the belly of the story, the main meaty part, and it has to end. And end quite dramatically, or not, depending on what you want. With that in mind, we can now go further and tell you that the story structure, the first act, the second act, and the third act. For movies, this is a typical structure. For television, it might vary. Television typically has anything from 4 to 6 to 8 acts, right? So, but that's a lecture for a different day. We're talking about movies. Movies typically have just 3 acts: a beginning, middle, end. Your first act, second act, third act. Your first act is your setup. Your second act is your confrontation. Your third act is your resolution. Now you're beginning to get the hang of it, right? Your first act, setup, basically means you're setting up the story. You're setting up the characters. You're setting up, putting all the ingredients that's meant to push your story forward. You introduce your characters, your major characters. Our little cat, our woman, in a jeep who adopts the cat. We set up, we introduce our dog, our helpful, bingo on the way. And we also introduce the evil maid in the house that kicks the cat away, right? These are our major characters. Setting them up. Who's the hero of your story? And who's the villain of your story? Who's your protagonist and who's your antagonist? Your protagonist basically is the major character, the good guy in your story. The person your story follows. That's the protagonist. The story is about him. Now, there's usually the villain or the antagonist is typically or usually that person, that character, or that thing or that event that's is stopping or is opposing your character, your hero. That's stopping your hero from achieving his or her goals or its goals, right? So, 2 opposing forces clashing, battle of the good and evil. That's storytelling for you, that right there. First act, setup. The second act is your confrontation. Just like I said, it's basically when the challenges that your character, your hero or your protagonist, your actor goes through in the story, right? Challenges, right? Something has to be stopping your character or your protagonist from achieving his goal, from getting what he wants, from becoming whatever he wants to become. Something has to be stopping him, right? If there isn't, then you really don't have a story. I'm sorry to say. And I think a lot of writers fall into that loophole where they start a story off and they really haven't worked out what's the conflict, what the problem is that the story is trying to solve, the character is trying to solve. And then they go on, and then it just feels like the characters are just, doing some mundane stuff and just, living their life, and the writers just keep writing and writing. And then at some point, it just ends the story. And you're wondering, okay, what happened? That's the problem. They didn't work out what the conflict in the story was. And you have to work out what is the conflict in the story. Take, for example, the wedding party. What do you think the conflict for the story in the wedding party was? Now, there were a lot of different conflicts, which we're going to come to much later, and those are called subplots. The conflict for wedding party that I saw was, the issue with the cheating with Banky W and Adeswa. Adeswa doesn't trust Banky W, and then there's this ex-girlfriend from the past who comes and is trying to scatter their marriage, right? And then eventually Adeswa sees pictures, a video of them frolicking the night before, and then she's convinced that Banky doesn't love me. Oh my goodness, he cheated on me, and she runs out of the wedding banquet. That's conflict right there. It's been wearing his head up. That was something that was waiting to happen, and it was happening throughout the film. Strong conflict. That's an example there. Then once you have your middle, that is confrontation, the second act, you move over to your third act. Your third act is basically your resolution. Your third act is usually, most times the shortest act. Sometimes it's a bit, lengthy, but it's most times your shortest act, because all that's happening there is that the characters are trying to resolve the conflict. Just like the name implies, a resolution. Easy. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Beginning, middle, end. Setup, confrontation, and resolution. So now that you know